Yeah, this film has been called the cinematic yardstick of cool, and I can't help but to agree fully. We're talking about Breathless today by the wonderful Jean-Luc Godard, the film that truly ushered in the French New Wave. Godard, along with Francois Truffaut, would go on to reinvent film and really become the architects of what we consider to be modern cinema. Especially the films that changed the world in the 90s. The Coens, the Tarantinos, the Soderberghs would not have any any foundation on which to build their own deconstructionist films if it had not been for films like Breathless. So I'm here with David, and we're going to go into it.
Yeah, so the first thing I wanted to ask you is, really what is the French New Wave?
The French New Wave really started, you can either say 1959 or 1960, but I'll say 1960 because that's when Breathless was released. 1959 saw The 400 Blows, which was Truffaut's first film. So the French New Wave was primarily, the architects of that were Truffaut and Godard, and those two together used to write film criticism and film theory for the Cahiers du Cinéma, a film magazine. They were film critics originally in the footsteps of Bresson. And the French New Wave was about injecting some life into film, was about changing film, was about reinventing it. But it was a really, if we want to look at it philosophically, it was a postmodern movement within film. People like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida were very popular and well-read at this time, also French philosophers within postmodernism. And Truffaut, at least early Truffaut films, and Godard throughout his entire career up to this day, made some very postmodern anti-statements with their films. And it was also to justify something called Auteur Theory, which I believe was formulated by André Bresson, the film critic who Truffaut and Godard looked up to very much. Auteur Theory essentially meant that you could watch a film, and based on the techniques used, based on the composition, you could tell who made it, who was the auteur. Because before that point, directors were kind of viewed, by the public at least, as simply... Not simply, they were still in high regard, but just as the people who photographed the narrative that you're watching. The story was far more important than the composition. People like Pauline Kael rebelled against the notion of auteur theory, which is very strange because today auteur theory is a given. It's not even a theory anymore, because we believe that you know when you're watching a David Lynch or a Quentin Tarantino film based on first viewing, because the auteur theory proved to be correct. It's not just a hypothesis. So I believe part of the French New Wave also is making the audience completely aware that the film they're watching is not only also self-aware, but that there is an obvious man behind the curtain putting it together. Things like Breathless are so overtly directed, so outrageously overtly directed, that you are always conscious of the fact that you are watching a film, and you are watching a very specific director making a film, and making you completely cognizant the entire time that you're watching it. Truffaut would do self-reference a lot, too.
Yeah, and in this particular film, you definitely see that technique employed several dozen times. But more particularly with the eye contact meeting the camera was a rule break. And Godard, he pioneered that here in this film. And he was basically, I think you mentioned before that Fellini also started doing that later.
Well, so 1960 was a huge year.
Yeah.
But Godard was far more inventive than Fellini at that precise moment, because 1960 is really the turning point for Fellini, where he was kind of stepping away, disavowing himself from the Rossellini school of neorealism, and adding... In 1960, he made La Dolce Vita, which added a lot of surrealist motifs, but the story itself was still primarily neo-realist. But he started to dance around the idea of surrealism, and of course, in 63, he would make 8.5, one of the ultimate surrealist, meta self-referential films. So this was before Fellini started playing with the idea of breaking the fourth wall, of being cognizant or self-aware. 1960 also saw La Ventura, the Michelangelo Antonioni film. So you could also say that an Italian New Wave was starting at the exact same time the French New Wave was. But the thing is, the Italian New Wave, Fellini and Antonioni, they had statements to make with all of their films, be they social, be they poetic. They had statements to make with their films. Godard and Truffaut almost had anti-statements to make. And of course, I'm speaking of Truffaut, like 1965 and earlier, because later on he would have many grand statements. Same with Godard, but even when he had a political statement to make, it was shrouded in this kind of anti-film grammar. But yeah, I believe he makes you aware that you're watching a film right from the start, where Jean-Paul Belmondo's character starts doing the Humphrey Bogart gestures with his lips, where he presses his thumb against it, and he's actually posing like an archetype from a film, but a very shallow representation of it. And then before he looks into the camera, we also get the jump cuts that populate this film, that overpopulate Breathless, the jump cuts, which is breaking a rule because that's not how you show a character traveling from one place to another, because the jump cuts don't have a systemic meaning to them. They're just simply jumping for the sake of jumping. But it's to make you aware, to kind of like keep you in the mode of, oh, I am watching something that was obviously directed. This is not a representation of real life. This is not realism. This is something entirely different.
Right. And I was really impressed by not only the composition of those particular jump scenes, but also the fact that the camera, he broke another rule with the camera by actually holding it and using it. And
you're right, yeah, because when it does those jump cuts in the car, the camera is sitting in the passenger seat as if the audience is there, but it's handheld. So it's also shaky jump cuts, which people hate today even. People can't get over that shit in found footage films today, and Godard was annoying his audience with it back in 1960.
Yeah, and I think one of the worst films I've ever seen when employing that was Cloverfields. It was so jarring. And
I wasn't a big fan of
handheld.
It. I do love the Blair Witch Project, but that's for other reasons. We'll cover that eventually on the channel, simply because it was made in one of the weirdest fucking ways possible. But this is about Breathless. Gosh, yeah, a lot of anti-statements being made here. One thing I found fascinating about the jump cut is that it has a systemic. When I say anti-meaning, I'm going to at least give you some specific material right now. I'm not going to go into every anti-meaning because it's populated with them. But since we're on the topic of jump cuts, the jump cut, if you use it in a film, is meant to imply only one thing: that you are pressed for time, that you need to get from point A to point B faster than normal. So Jean-Luc Godard uses this jump cut all of the time, except when we're in a room with dialogue that is completely unnecessary and goes on for about 15 minutes of just empty, shallow talk.
Yeah.
But Godard's like, oh no, we have time for this. We have time for this. I'm not jump cutting. We have time. So that's an anti-message right there. He's even showing that, like, yeah, I understand what the concept of a jump cut is supposed to represent, and I'm not going to use it that way. I'm going to use the jump cut at points of action, not at points of relaxation, of reflection.
Right. And I was really impressed, not only that, but just how brilliant that was, because his anti-statements, do paint the main character, Michel, as this really shallow, really superficial person. And he's doing that on purpose because he's trying to get the audience to have he's really just trying to get at the expression more than he's trying to get at the rules. And he's breaking the rules on purpose in order to make that expression more overt, more obvious. And that, I think, is something that is really, really sets him apart.
Absolutely. I mean, a large way that you could view this film is as a deconstruction of the American gangster genre of romantic cinema, which are most of the time pretty shallow films when you get right down to it. So he's taking something shallow and deconstructing it into something even emptier.
Yeah.
Which is very surprising to do.
And there's that anti-romance message in there about halfway through the film when Michel and Patricia are talking to each other, and Michelle's in bed and she's looking over at the photo of Romeo and Juliet, and she's saying, why aren't we more like Romeo and Juliet? And it's like, you don't want to be like Romeo and Juliet. It's very puppy love, very childish kind of love, and you're exploring love and you don't know what love really is, and that's really what Shakespeare's trying to get at. But then she's trying to emulate that. Very, very much the opposite of what Shakespeare was intending. And so I thought, Godard including that was very masterful. So
exactly. And if you want to look at the the ending of the film as an anti-tragedy, as like the antithesis of the Romeo and Juliet tale. That's also a remarkable way to look at it. Even then, though, you might be taking it too seriously.
Yeah.
To even inject that kind of paralleled meaning, because it's not about parallel meanings. It's just about an overall anti-purpose.
Yeah, very absurd.
Incredibly absurd. But if it's married to any sort of philosophy, it's not the Camus or Beckett idea of absurdism. I think it's definitely Foucault.
Yeah.
I think it's most definitely postmodernism, to the point where he's deconstructing social constructs. Like, it can't get more meta than this film. Can't get more self-referential than what he's diving into. It can't be more full of meaning and more completely devoid of any at the same exact time.
And I was really glad and very very much grateful for seeing this film, because then you can get a real solid picture of pictures of filmmaking and see that transition happening from the classic film cinema to the postmodern. And that, I think, is one of the outstanding aspects of this film, is the fact that you actually do see that transition happening in real time in the film. And, if you watched older films, like I've watched many older films, and then seeing that and also seeing modern film and really watching all the techniques being employed by Godard being injected in modern film and then just completely absent in the classic film genres.
Absolutely. And we see them overused today. They become commonplace. But in 1960, it was completely explosive and innovative, out of left field. Certainly a derisive picture, something that split people down the middle. And I think continues to do that. A lot of people go and view Breathless because it's an essential viewing, and they don't see the importance of it, which just kind of makes them oblivious. Because it's staring you directly in the face, actually jump cutting nearer and nearer.
I'm glad I can see that. I can see the pivotal role that it is playing in film and cinematography, because more than that, it's just he's really just lampooning against all of the other films and their messages, because he's trying to say, what's more important is not only the filmmaker, but the audience's reaction as well. And so that's why he is creating one-dimensional, shallow characters, because what's more important for Godard here is seeing how the audience reacts, what the audience identifies with. If you identify with Michel, why are you identifying with him? Is it really despairing, or do you just actually find despair in real life or not? That kind of thing. So I thought that was pretty interesting that he knew that and that he purposefully put it in there, and that was just beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful. And of course, Jean-Paul Belmondo as Michel, one of the most recognizable French actors of the 60s, thanks to Godard's film Breathless. Godard himself would use him again and again in films like A Woman is a Woman and Pierrot Le Fou. And Belmondo was one. I could see what Godard saw in him. This was the first and only time he used Jean Seberg, who I've always loved Jean Seberg for her 50s work with her then husband Otto Preminger, another master. We'll cover Preminger eventually as well. But in films like Saint Joan and Bonjour Tristesse. So Preminger had a muse, but he only had a muse for 2 films, and then she made this film Breathless. Sadly, she would kill herself about 10 years later. But gosh, I thought that she was wonderful in this film. She met the Jean-Paul Belmondo's shallowness on every level and nearly exceeded it as well. And Godard, it's interesting watching Breathless because this was before he met his muse. So some of his most loved work outside of Contempt and Breathless feature Anna Karenina, who is gorgeous, and he would frame her as Pabst framed Louise Brooks in Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, in films like Vivre sa vie, Made in USA, Pierrot Le Fou, Woman is a Woman, used her all the time. So this is Godard pre-muse, and it wasn't until Anna Karenina and A Band Apart that he truly had something meaningful to say, and it was always said through her. through the purity of Karina. So this was Godard before he even had formulated a statement, but I find it fascinating because he's obviously someone who loved film so much. He was part of Cahiers du Cinema. It was just like Truffaut, and the idea that they probably spent their entire lives dreaming of what film they would make if they got the chance. And this was it. Which is interesting, because Truffaut's first film, The 400 Blows, was nearly autobiographical, super touching story, portrait of youth. Very touching. Breathless. Am I supposed to think that Godard spent his entire life up to that point being like, when I get the chance to make a film, I have absolutely nothing to say. Like, that's incredible. That's incredible. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I do. I definitely see what you're saying. I was also impressed by the fact that that Godard purposefully made Michelle's character just so petty. Mm-hmm. Like, not only in the first 5 minutes do you see him kill a cop because a cop's trying to pull him over. Pretty sure that the vehicle he was driving was stolen, and that's why, right? Yeah. And so then that pettiness was just there immediately, pretty much. But then not only in his dialogue, right, as he's just driving and saying, women are, this and women are that. And then he goes around and he's completely contradictory and he steals money from her, that lady, right after she offers him money.
Yeah, and he's petty way beyond the point that we could even identify as shallow. Godard paints him so broadly, he can't even fit into the very wide category of an archetype. He is that shallow because he spends his entire time posing and posturing as if, like, trying to be a Bogart gangster character, but he's too shallow to even imitate a shallow American idealized form. He can't even do that. He is one of the most empty protagonists in film.
Very empty, yeah. And he that emptiness continues onward in the film. He's, trying to be cool, and he's asking for some eggs, and then he just walks away, doesn't even eat breakfast. Like, I'm just going to request this, and then, I'm not a human. I don't need to eat.
What'd you think of the scene with the most famous French director of the 50s was Jean-Pierre Melville, and I'm sure Godard and Truffaut were admirers of at least a few of his films. Belmondo himself would be in his films as well. But he plays a role in this where interviewers, reporters, including Gene Seberg's character, is interviewing him, asking him questions, and he seems to be giving incredibly superficial answers, but covered in, shrouded in, masqueraded in the most pretentious or superfluous dialogue.
Yeah, I definitely felt that vibe was very overt. I was really enjoying of the fact that the questions used did at first glance seem meaningful, but then when you started to analyze it, you're just like, why are they even having this interview in the first place?
Yeah. And he ignored Gene Seberg's question of what is your greatest ambition in life. He ignored her right up front, and then she asked another question, and he flirted with her, and then she repeated her question of what's your biggest ambition in life, and his answer was to become immortal and then die.
Oh, that was just great. And what was really amazing about that is just, like, we see it on a lot of modern technology and technological innovation. We see this sort of, like, this want for this holy grail, this want for immortality, but then, someone's like, well, I want to die eventually. So, Godard's saying something pretty profound here. He's really saying, why do people want immortality in the first place if eventually they want to die anyway?
Yeah, and I think that Godard was so referential, so meta, that line could just as easily be how do you become immortal and then die? Well, you become immortalized on film. Those things never die. And that's why Gene Seberg's response is so Hitchcockian in its framing of her looking so startled at the camera, and the music kind of swells at that point. And it is truly a Hitchcockian moment because I feel that Gene Seberg is recognizing her own immortality on film. As I think Godard made most of his films had a lot to say about film without actually addressing the medium itself.
That's a good point, yeah. I mean, I guess I was in some ways subtly aware of it, but you saying that out loud was really helpful, so thank you.
Yeah, well, to even assume at that moment that Godard was trying to say something about the human condition betrays the language that he sets up in that movie. So if he actually did have some powerful message about the human spirit, that would be a flaw. So I do think it's more meta, more referential to the actual act of watching a film. Like, you make these people immortal by watching the film that they're on.
Gotcha. So yeah, that's good. That's good that I recognize that. Thank you for pointing that out.
I mean, in fact, like Gene Seberg and Jean Melville are long dead, but they were alive in my living room when we were watching this film. We brought them back to life. We conjured them. So they were immortal, and the second we turned it off, they died again.
Hooray! No, I'm just kidding.
I think that might be how Godard views a lot of it. A lot of film.
And then you have that same narrative going onward. You have Patricia going out of her way to do contradictory things. She's calling the police on Michel and trying to get him arrested, but then at the same time going to him and saying, "I called the police." So that was pretty interesting too, that she was also superficial in that way as well. And it's more telling of my own personal character flaws than it is of anything else. If I paid attention to that, why am I paying attention to that? Do I have contradictions? Absolutely. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. Godard's one of the most contradictory filmmakers ever in the history of film. But that leads to the climax, which is, for all of its unnecessary components to Breathless, the ending is one of the most famous endings in film, with Belmondo lying on the ground, calling her a louse or a slut. That's one of the most famous endings in French cinema. And it's quoted, it's mirrored, it's homaged, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's hilarious, because what does this anti-romance amount to? It doesn't amount to tragedy. It amounts to your shallow character giving another shallow character a shallow insult. Because the climax isn't him being killed. The climax is him calling her a bitch.
Basically.
Like, that's the memorable part of that scene, and that's the scene that is constantly paid tribute to by other filmmakers.
And then isn't that the last statement he makes is, "You make me want to puke"? Yeah. And then the guy who's standing, the detective standing over him, is like, repeats what he says to her, because she's like, "What did he say?" Mm-hmm. And then there's nothing. It just says the end.
Absolutely. And Godard is so meta, so self-referential, that he implants himself into his own film. Because when his film begins to lack action, to lack any sort of forward momentum or suspense, he has to come in and personally give it on camera by identifying him from a newspaper and telling the police where they are, without any spoken words, of course. But that's what happens when his own film starts to slow down. Godard has to impose himself into his own work so that he could make the action start again, and make it actually start to feel like it has some sort of pace, momentum, or some sort of place that it's going.
Yeah,
it doesn't.
What he's really doing here is he's trying to recapture your attention, because he's trying to make you pay attention. He's trying to make you self-reflective.
Exactly, and the brilliant part of it is that the director himself has to give himself a role where he has to do this. You can even call that role the role of the director, because he comes out and he sends the cops after them. That's essentially what he does. So his own cameo is one of the most self-referential cameos on film. When you get down to the function of what his cameo was doing.
If you had to say it in one sentence, what would you say Godard's entire message is for Breathless?
His entire message for Breathless, I just think it's about rebellion. That's the message. Just about because if I said that his message was reinventing the wheel, then that would give him too much cognizance of, because there's no possible way he expected this film to be as successful as it was. I think that the point of the film was rebellion.
I can see that.
It ended up reinventing the wheel, but it was just about rebellion. Subverting expectations was certainly one of them.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because it sets up a lot of scenarios through character roles and dilemmas, and doesn't follow through on nearly any of them.
Yeah, pretty much. And, there's also the fact that
In fact, goes to great lengths to not follow through.
Yeah, and not only that, but still is a sort of plot, but the plot is only based loosely around like crime and finding justice. But then that's not even there either. That's more like it turns into this funny like police chase kind of thing where it's comical. It's absolutely comical. So
I did appreciate the jazzy score, and that adds to the postmodern flavor of it as well, because jazz is nothing if not almost a postmodern art movement, since it's about improvisation, since it's about deconstructing a melody to its core fundamentals and then expanding on it in a lyrical new way.
Yeah.
So even the score reflects Godard's purpose and premise with the film.
And there's a lot of other things being, other things that I saw and identify with, and because of the self-reflective nature of this movie, me seeing those things, I realize, like where my own personal life narratives are headed, kind of thing. Like, for example, the stealing of vehicles left and right. At first it was just me having this sort of knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that's wrong. But then it's just like, but this isn't a serious film. So why do I think it's wrong?
It's a film that's cognizant of the fact that it's a film. So when he goes and needs a car, well, what are the points? What's the point of a car in a film unless to be driven? Like, it constantly makes you aware. It constantly keeps you self-aware, and you have to meet that too. You have to be as self-aware of the film as the film is of you, because I do think another one of Godard's, it's all about rebellion, so every one of Godard's techniques is a rebellious technique because it simply goes out of its way to break a rule or break a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just to constantly keep you aware that there is an architect of this film, and that what you're watching is architecture being made.
And then even then, architecture itself is also referenced in the movie a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Michelle saying, oh, I don't like that building, that eyesore over there.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty interesting that basically Godard was like kind of making fun of himself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was pretty brilliant there as well. I also wanted to go a little more forward in my questions, if you don't mind. I wanted to ask you...
Oh shit, you've asked like one.
I
hope that answers what the French New Wave was.
But I wanted to ask you, what do you think Godard was really trying to get at when he was trying to, like, paint Patricia as this louse, and why he included that in particular?
Well, I think that has to go to the fact that it was Jean Seberg, that it was a recognizable American actress. And there's a lot of talk in the film about the difference between the love-making, the eroticism between women from different countries, but especially the difference between American women and French women, and that American women dominate their men, and that the French women don't, yet.
Right.
And I believe that Patricia completely dominates Michel. Mm-hmm. I believe emasculates him and gets him killed in the end. If that's not the ultimate domination, then I don't know what is. I believe that her purpose in it was the American influence on French cinema, truly.
Gotcha. Okay. So then, following up on that, I would also like to ask Michel, his role, as more of a submissive kind of...
Well, I think that's also another statement by Godard, and I don't think it is a veiled attack on Melville, because Melville had made like Bob Le Flambier and other 50s gangster films that were incredibly inspired by what was going on in American gangster films of the 30s to the 50s. So, if in my analysis, if Jean Seberg represents the American influence directly on a French film, then Jean-Paul Belmondo is the French filmmaker aping, like grossly imitating the American aesthetics. And he can't do it correctly because that's not part of his culture, and also it's a shallow archetype that you're trying to conjure in the first place, and that when fakery meets a genuine article, the fakery fails in comparison.
Of course,
that's part of my analysis, I would say. getting down to it, I do think that Michelle is representative of the overwhelming influence of American cinema in. We got a phone call. We had a telemarketer call. But no, I hope that answered part of your question.
It did. It does. It definitely does. So, my next follow-up question is, again, along the same lines. Godard, I want to know why it is he included Melville in that particular scene.
Yeah, that's what I was asking you, too.
Yeah, because I think
he's like a peon of French filmmaking at that moment. He was like the most recognizable French filmmaker before Godard and Truffaut, because Renoir was basically done making films at that time. So what you had was Melville. And Melville, the difference between Melville and Jean Renoir, who made The Rules of the Game and Grand Illusion in the 30s and 40s, is that Renoir was completely French, inspired by Frenchness, by French culture. And Melville, like I said, is deeply inspired by Humphrey Bogart, by Raoul Walsh, by George Raft, by those kinds of gangster films from America. So I'm trying also to piece together exactly why it was Melville in that situation. Maybe because it is the god of film talking down to its audience. The audience is going to the film with these questions about life, with these important questions about eroticism and about the meaning of existence and ambition. And you're asking that from a film? That's not where you should ask those questions, because that's not where Godard believes you're going to receive those answers.
Gotcha.
So Melville is giving them the most superficial answers, like I said, dressed up in very complicated language, but he's saying incredibly basic things to them, and they're eating it up. They're eating it up. Because Godard's also famous for one of his quotes of, you cannot talk about a film like you do a woman because you cannot touch a woman. You cannot love a woman the same way you can love a film. So if he believes in anything, it's that film cannot fill these voids. It cannot answer these questions for you.
I think that's a beautiful statement and that actually helps me answer your question about Melville and his role. I think what he's really trying to get at, Godard specifically, is he's trying to say you shouldn't look outside in the outside world for the answers. You have to self-reflect, and that's the whole nature of this, is to self-reflect and to really answer the questions yourself in relation to your own life, rather than go out and look for it in film, in technology, or in relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that answers that question.
Phones are going haywire. I do think it's composed wonderfully, made up of jump cuts and self-reference and homages, very obvious ones to Hitchcock, Melville, Dreyer even, you could probably argue.
Yeah.
So, do you have any final thoughts?
I'm just really glad that I saw this film. I think it's something any person who is a film aficionado or a cinephile should watch, or even if you're not a cinephile, you should watch it anyway, just because obviously people hearing this, it's an analysis you probably already have, but, just like, recommend it to friends, recommend it to other people, because it's just one of those films that really helps you piece together the deeper nature of what it means to watch and deconstruct a film, and those techniques, the talents being employed here are really important, and really trying to find deeper meaning in your own personal life and not using film as a crutch.
Exactly.
So that if I had to say that, please recommend this film. Get your friends to watch it and try and become more painfully self-aware.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful place to go on. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Thanks a lot.